So Amazon just released a Fallout TV adaptation, and while it was overall well received, especially among Bethesda fans, a lot of people who enjoy the original Fallout games and New Vegas did bring up a fair amount of complaints. Now that by itself is not a big deal, after all you will never please everybody, but I do find it a little disheartening to see the blame being shifted onto the New Vegas fans being over negative, as if criticism against the show is somehow unjustified. Now, I myself is a lover of science fiction, and Fallout New Vegas is one of my favorite sci-fi RPGs I've ever played. And so, for the most part, I do sympathize with the critics of the show. But it is important to point out that there is a very clear distinction in how Bethesda approaches the Fallout series versus how Obsidian approaches it. You see, the original Fallout games, plus New Vegas, were predominantly focused on the science fiction elements. Bethesda, on the other hand, is more interested in creating sandbox games. Their team is far more comfortable creating large open worlds filled with a bunch of toys that are essentially just there for players to dick around in. And because of this distinction, you have a very fractured fanbase. Now, this of course is not particularly unusual. I mean, just look at Star Wars, where sure, you have some people who genuinely enjoyed all the movies, but others who, understandably, dislike either the prequels or the Disney trilogy or both. But that doesn't necessarily mean one side is stupid and the other is toxic. No, people can enjoy the same things for different reasons. But neither does it mean that any of the criticism against it is illegitimate. And hopefully by the end of this video, I would have covered most of the problems with the TV adaptation that's gotten many New Vegas fans and science fiction fans disappointed. One of the biggest problems I had with the show was the amount of cringy characters that was just thrown at the screen. Now, if you're someone who's only familiar with the Bethesda Fallout games, specifically Fallout 3 and Fallout 4, then you might think that this is perfectly normal and what a Fallout setting is supposed to look like. But that is only because Bethesda is incapable of writing interesting dialogue for compelling characters. If you were to closely look at the cast of New Vegas, you'll find that there are characters like Veronica, a Brotherhood scribe who spent her life trying to convince the rest of her family to abandon their old ways and accept reality, only for her to end up as an outcast herself. And you also have characters like Caesar, who clearly read a book detailing the conquest of Julius Caesar, and decided that the best chance for society to prosper in the wasteland was to have a strong leader with no separation of powers. The point is, the Fallout universe has a ton of relatable and very different characters, some with very extreme hardline ideologies, but also others who are more moderate and focus on immediate personal issues. That's what made the setting of New Vegas so believable and immersive. They were not all a bunch of naive whack jobs written by a 15-year-old, which, considering how you have people like Todd Howard and the writer of Captain Marvel being credited for the show, isn't too unexpected. I mean, Todd Howard famously tried to remove all NPCs from 76 just to minimize the amount of writing they had to do for the game, and regardless of what you felt about the Captain Marvel movie as a whole, it was one of the few Marvel movies that actually screwed up the characters. They were lazily written with no meaningful growth and were completely one-dimensional. Now, I've heard some people try to make the claim that the Ghoul is somehow an interesting character, but to me he's just another murder hobo. Like, what was his motivation in the show? What, did he want to find his family from centuries ago before the bombs fell or something? His story is not that fleshed out or even memorable when you look at it objectively. Like, it's fine to have a violent character in your show, but you need to weave him into your story. Like, take Joshua Grant for instance. He is very much a might makes right kind of guy, and believes that the best hope for a peaceful tribe to survive was basically to become the biggest, baddest dude on the block, so that their neighbors wouldn't dare crossing them. Which is a very realist way to look at politics, and one that's hard to argue against. But throughout the story, his actions do make you wonder if this is the best thing to do. After all, if the only way to save a peaceful culture is to indoctrinate them into war, then are you really saving them? The point is, inserting these characters into a bigger narrative is what makes them compelling. That's what was missing from the TV show. And just to all the fake progressives out there in the industry, having a female lead or ethnically diverse cast doesn't solve this problem and can't be used as a substitute for good writing. So now let's move on and talk about the second big problem, which is the factions, specifically how poorly they were utilized in the story, because it's obvious that neither the writers of the show nor Bethesda understand how to write science fiction, and the best they can do is throw familiar objects at the audience and hope that it is somehow enough to entertain them. I'll show you what I mean. Let's take two examples, the Brotherhood of Steel and the NCR. Now, the Brotherhood is presented in the show as a military cult that is predominantly interested in collecting dangerous technology, because they believe that is the best way to prevent another apocalypse, which is the encyclopedia definition on what they were all about when they were first formed, shortly after the bombs fell. The problem is these writers don't seem to have the ability to imagine where this faction might end up over time. You see, it's been centuries since the bombs fell, and society in the far universe has moved on from the apocalypse. It is currently in a state of rebuilding, and so a technology-hoarding faction like the Brotherhood doesn't really have a place there anymore. They are in fact a relic of the past, a group that often gets in the way of other factions that are interested in nation building, which in turn drives conflict. That's what makes the Brotherhood interesting. It's not because they have cool looking power armor, which is probably the only reason why Bethesda likes them so much, but rather because they are fighting for a cause that is no longer relevant. How a small military cult fits into a world with great powers is infinitely more interesting than the little gimmicks that the TV show is presenting. This is why in New Vegas the Brotherhood is portrayed as have been effectively defeated by the NCR, and its few remnant forces are hiding in bunkers, just slowly being forgotten in the ash piles of history. If you wanted to tell a story about the Brotherhood of Steel, you can, but you need to understand how they fit into your world. A good science fiction writer could have easily told a story about how one disillusioned Brotherhood initiate tried to defect from the Order by working with an outsider to liberate what's essentially a cult. But no, instead we have what? The Brotherhood got after another technology MacGuffin because that's what the encyclopedia says, and we're not creative enough to come up with anything interesting that could lead to new stories. Likewise, we have a similar problem with the NCR, which is also portrayed in just the most surface level way possible. In effect, all we learned about the NCR in the TV show was that they wanted a way to provide electricity to the population, which I guess is something they would be involved in, but again, that's not what makes the NCR interesting. The thing about the NCR is that in their efforts to rapidly expand their territory, they have overextended. They've taken on more people and problems that they have the resources to support, and are forced to make hard choices at the expense of their own population. This is why back at home you have criminal gangs running amok and drug cartels poisoning the population. They can't effectively solve these problems because all their resources are committed to the frontiers. And the only way forward, tragically, is to acquire more resources by annexing more territory, which in turn means inheriting even more problems. It is, as one character would describe, as a lumbering beast slowly dying of starvation, which is a wonderful analogy for the situation the NCR is in. That's what makes the NCR interesting. They are a parallel to modern-day America. Their hunger for resources and hegemony has gotten them into a trap of their own making, and now they are beginning to crumble from the inside out. Again, there is a gold mine of material here just waiting for a creative writer to take advantage of. But what did we get instead? We just have some random NCR lady who might as well have been any random raider form a weird sex cult after their capital got blown up only to be eventually defeated by the Brotherhood. It's almost like the writers didn't know what to do with the NCR and just decided to get rid of him in the laziest way possible. It really does remind me of a lot of the recent Star Wars movies we've been seeing where the writers are like, well, we need some rebels to blow up a super weapon and, I don't know, a lightsaber fight between a Jedi and a Sith. And that's all they can come up with, despite having access to the entire Star Wars universe. All they can do is constantly regurgitate the same familiar things over and over again. These show writers just don't have the capacity to imagine how these factions might adapt over time, or heck, even imagine the consequences of them failing to adapt over time, which is a critical skill to have in the business of science fiction writing. So let's wrap up by talking about the issues with the tone, and especially with the pre-war scenes. Now, the show presents American society as naively optimistic, right up until the bombs fell. But that's just not what American society was like in the far universe. People need to understand that this was a society subjected to intense Cold War propaganda, and Americans were extremely paranoid of their neighbors. This was a totalitarian and possibly fascist America. Society was in a dark place. And on top of that, there was also the geopolitical dimension. We learned from propaganda reels in the early Fallout games that America was in an intense security competition with the Chinese and annexed countries like Canada. This hints at what was going on geopolitically. both powers were trying to dominate their region of influence. And so it's very easy to picture a scenario where the Americans had attempted to contain the Chinese, forcing them to retaliate and push out American forces in places like Alaska, which in turn triggered an escalation into a general thermonuclear war. All it takes is a little bit of creativity, and you can deliver a very compelling narrative on how the bombs fell. But no, what did we get instead? It was all the evil corporation that was behind everything because capitalism is evil. Like, okay, I get that Vault-Tec was evil, but they're not cartoonishly evil like the Umbrella Corporation where they're like, let's think of a way to destroy the world for money! Like, no, they were more the morally bankrupt, profit over people, corporate evil. Like Boeing or Amazon, ironically. Like, if you really sat down and thought about it, it's not difficult to piece together what may have happened with the vaults. Like, some corporate lobbyists probably sweet-talked the US government into privatizing a contingency plan against nuclear war. They of course cut corners because, hey, come on, no one's ever gonna actually use them because the whole point of having nuclear weapons is deterrence. And while we're here, might as well convince the government to use these vaults for social experiments just to earn that little bit of extra dough. And then deterrence fails. And the bombs start raining down. Now you got a bunch of poorly made vaults being mostly misused for dodgy commercial purposes instead of acting like proper life-saving facilities. Cause that's what happens when there's no corporate oversight. It's why you have some vaults with only a single water chip and others with an excess of hundreds. It's a basic logistic problem stemming from incompetence. That's what Vault-Tec is. They are not some master puppeteer playing 4D chess with global politics. And while we're on the subject, some of the worst scenes in the entire show were the vault scenes. Like, the vaults are supposed to be a window into the pre-war past. They should have been used as a device to show how a heavily propagandized microcosm of society might turn out in a claustrophobic setting. So why are they all optimistic naive fools? Like, I always thought the silly subtext in Cold War propaganda reels was just there to hide the fact that the government had no serious humanitarian response to a nuclear war.
Duck and cover. Paul and Patty know this. No matter where they go or what they do, they always try to remember what to do if the atom bomb explodes right then. It's a bomb. Duck and cover. Sundays, holidays, vacation time, we must be ready every day, all the time, to do the right thing if the atomic bomb explodes. Duck and cover!
But in reality, most people were probably frightened out of their minds that at any moment something could go wrong and they could all be vaporized. That's the thing about an existential threat like nuclear war. It really sharpens the mind. It's why you have some people building their own bomb shelters in preparation for the end of the world while mistrusting their neighbors, thinking that they might be communist spies. Like, look at this scene. Why are these people having a birthday party on the day of the apocalypse? Like, what, so we can have a non-payoff scene later in the series where the ghoul talks about how he misses his family or some shit? Their eyes should be glued to the TV screen as they're preparing to grab everything they can when the sirens go off. And this disconnect couldn't be made more obvious as the episode dragged on, where we see the screenwriters just constantly teleport characters around to the next set piece. It's not because they're trying to tell a more concise story, but rather because they're purposely rushing us along to the next joke since that's all they got. In fact, they literally go out of their way to kill off characters right before they get a chance to explain anything that could advance the plot. It's almost like the writers are afraid that the audience might realize just how nonsensical the overall plot is as soon as they're given a moment of pause. And so the only solution they can come up with is to keep rushing forward and hope nobody would notice. It's reminiscent of The Last Skywalker actually. And look, just to reiterate, if you genuinely like the show for whatever your reasons, good for you. You're clearly in the majority and you're gonna get a lot more of this content. But honestly, I do feel sympathy for the New Vegas fans because it really does feel like Bethesda has some sort of grudge against Obsidian at this point, and I don't just mean that in a sense that they're clearly not interested in letting Obsidian work on another Fallout game, but also that they're going out of their way to kill off all the storylines that they carefully set up in New Vegas. I mean, for God's sakes, they literally had the Brotherhood finish off what remains of the NCR in what could only be described as a clown fight with guns. Like, seriously, this scene was so silly, I was actually expecting a pie-in-the-face gag at some point. This show was childish, and it's reflective of how Bethesda behaves behind the scenes. It's like they're upset that Obsidian had upstaged them, and instead of doing the mature thing, which is to collaborate to improve their own games, they instead went with the whole "I'm taking my ball and going home" approach to business. But yeah, my sympathies to the folks who were hoping for a quality science fiction show. You're probably never gonna get another good Fallout game, but hey, you probably already figured that part out based on the trailer of this show and also the recent Fallout games. I mean, by now it should be pretty obvious that the Fallout series going forward is not gonna be anything other than just a big sandbox filled with shiny toys. Anyway, that was my video. Let me know your opinions on the topic in the comments below. Thanks for watching.